Hi, everyone. This is Talk Back, and we have a wonderful show for you today. All this summer during the pandemic, we've been doing shows on the live stream platform. This is live on Facebook. It will be on channel 14 and channel 1070 in the Comcast TV viewing area for those who live in the Norwich and surrounding towns. This is the year of the 100th anniversary of women getting the right to vote in the 19th Amendment in 1920. We have to celebrate these women, and we're not talking about it enough because, yes, we have so many other things on our plate this season. But there are women who were pioneers, who were so advanced in their thinking, in their philosophies, in their behaviors of courage, that we must celebrate them as we celebrate this year, the 100th anniversary. So I'd like to introduce my two special guests today, who are going to talk about a very important woman who needs more recognition. She's actually the state heroine in Connecticut. Did you know that? Prudence Crandall, celebrated in a museum in Canterbury, Connecticut. So let me introduce Joanie DiMartino, who is the curator of that wonderful museum. Hi, Joanie.
Hi, Sheila. Nice to be here today. Can you hear me all right?
Yes, we can. And Jennifer Rycenga. Did I pronounce that properly, Jennifer?
Rycenga, yes, very good.
Rycenga, sorry. Rycenga. And yes. She is a professor of comparative religion, humanities at San Jose State University in California, and she's writing a book on Prudence Crandall. So this could not be a better time to talk about these issues. Jennifer, tell us a little bit about yourself. You've got a very august academic career, and you're writing a book. Why? How did you come to be interested in these things, and what is the importance of Prudence Crandall?
Well, first, Sheila, I want to thank you very much for inviting me to be on the program. And I have an interest in women and religion issues, and I also have an interest in how women actually have created social change. And those interests came together in the person of Prudence Crandall. When I first encountered Prudence Crandall, it was in 1999, and my mother and I were traveling in southern New England, and I had heard about the beginnings of the abolition movement in 1831 in Boston, the immediate abolition movement. And I was already interested when I learned about Prudence Crandall from one of the Freedom Trail brochures. So I stopped by the museum with my mother, and I just fell in love with Prudence Crandall. Here's a woman who lived a very long life from 1803 to 1890. And during that time, she changed her religious perspectives at least 3 times in a major way, and probably more times than that even. She started out as a Quaker. She later became a Baptist, and then she moved into spiritualism later on in her life. And in each of these religious way stations, she was helping to create social change. And then she was a white woman who was working with Black women and men to create greater racial equality in the United States. I saw this story right away, and I knew that it was something that was worthy of sustained attention. Little did I know just how much Prudence Crandall was worthy of such sustained attention, because it turns out that her school for Black women that ran for 2 years from 1833 to 1834 created a moment of interracial cooperation, but also one that directly benefited women and that made women's political voices more possible than they had been before. So Prudence Crandall becomes this pivot point, really, in an understanding of history that includes men and women, Black and white people, which is the America we need to be living in, and the America that we see being created even in our current tumult. So I hope that gives you a beginning of an answer to your question.
That's an excellent perspective. And you know, when you think about it, we don't talk about these women enough. And it's amazing to know that she was born in, I think you said 1803. And in the 1830s, she was having a school that integrated Black and white girls. And it's amazing. This is before Seneca Falls in 1848, when the suffrage movement really gets going. This is before the Civil War. This is before the Constitution changes to give Blacks the right to vote and some equal rights, which we're still fighting for. So it is amazing that there were women like Prudence Crandall so far ahead of their times. I think it's fantastic that we're talking about her and highlighting her, and people need to know more about her. So now let's turn to Joanie, because she's got a museum that she's the curator of that is devoted to the Prudence Crandall story. It's in the house where the school was. Tell us about your interest in your career in these issues. I know you're also involved in the centennial, the state celebration of the suffrage, the voting centennial. And tell us about the history of the museum and how you got involved in it.
Sure, absolutely. Phil, I also want to thank you for having me on today. It's a pleasure to be here with you and with Jennifer. And essentially, my background is I've been in the museum history field for about 25 years. My college education has all been in public history, which is not a term a lot of people know, but we bridge the place between general visitors and the scholarship. So we are the people that are the archivists, the curators, the educators in museums. And so this is pretty much what I have done my whole life. And I've worked at many different museums, large and small. My scholarly background is actually in the women's suffrage movement. So yes, I'm also involved in the Women's Centennial with the state of Connecticut. And then I'm also representing Connecticut on the National Votes for Women Trail, which is run by the National Collaborative for Women's History Sites, along with the Pomeroy Marker Foundation. And I'm originally from New Jersey, so my scholarship was on Alice Paul, who was another very famous Quaker suffragist who was involved in social action. So it almost seemed a perfect fit for me when this opportunity opened to apply for this job as curator of the Prudence Crandall Museum. As Jennifer said, another Quaker social rights activist. It just seemed a dream job for me, essentially, where I can also share women's history and the history of social activism. And as Jennifer said, there's so many stories here in this 1-2 year period that happened that was very tumultuous in Connecticut and in Canterbury that more people really need to know about. So I did replace a curator who retired after 35 years of dedication and service to both the state of Connecticut and the Prudence Crandall story. And so I'm building on her foundation. The museum is currently going through a renovation. So even had it not been for the pandemic, we would be closed this summer anyway. But it's really given us the opportunity to look at how we're telling the story. And Jennifer's book is really going to influence, along with Cabria Baumgartner's book that just came out, how we tell the story, the museum experience to the visitor, because the museum was a site of racial violence, and there was a mob attack on the school, which we'll talk about later. So there really isn't a lot that is there from Prudence or the students. So the site itself is our most important artifact. When you're walking our floorboards, when you're in the walls and in the rooms, in those spaces, this is where it happened. This is where those discussions occurred, where Prudence said yes to Sarah's ask to be a student, where discussions on how they were going to approach her trial took place. And so it's really the most important artifact we have. We want to make sure that it is preserved properly. After Prudence closes down her school in 1834, the site once again becomes a private residence until 1969, when it is purchased by the state of Connecticut with the purpose of turning it into a museum. It becomes a museum in 1984, getting my dates confused. And then in 1991, it becomes a National Historic Landmark. And then in 1995, Prudence Crandall is designated the state heroine of the state of Connecticut. So we have this wonderful long history here of preserving these stories, and we're hoping to tell a lot more of these stories in detail after we reopen, hopefully in about another year.
That's terrific. Now, isn't there a statue also of Prudence Crandall in the state capitol in Hartford?
There is, yes, there is a statue that's actually titled Prudence Crandall and Student. A lot of people kind of make the mistake that think that the student is Sarah Harris. It is not a sculpture of Sarah Harris, but it is Prudence Crandall and a student that she would be inspiring. And, you know, I also want to be very clear that the students inspired Prudence as well, that Sarah Harris and Mariah Davis, who we'll talk about, you know, were, educating Prudence as well as Prudence educating them on what their life experiences were about. And that in turn, I think, inspired Prudence to continue her journey to fight for abolition. I also want to briefly mention that later in life, Prudence also became a suffragist and worked with Susan B. Anthony's cousin out in Illinois. So, I mean, the threads of the progressive movements that were occurring throughout the 19th century, Prudence was right in line with all of them. She was really a forerunner of a lot of major movements that were happening in that time period.
Okay. And how close to the original school is your museum? It was taken over, as you said, by private ownership, and then it went back to the state to create your historical museum. How close is it to what it actually looked like back when Prudence ran the school?
That's an excellent question. You know, in 1834, there's no photography. We can't really tell. We do have drawings by John Barber that we try to follow, but because we are a National Historic Landmark, we have to follow the guidelines of the Secretary of the Interior when we do any kind of renovation, reconstruction. It is the original building. It was set on fire in 1834 in January, but the fire had been put out. The building was saved. So we try to save as much original material as possible with every renovation that we do, whether it's fixing a door or something significant like we're undertaking now with supporting structural beams and exterior painting and redoing the roof, things like that.
Okay, so before we get to the slideshow that Jennifer has put together, I just wanted to ask this of Jennifer. I noticed that in the suffragette movement and many of the women active in progressive causes in the 1800s, they all started out, many of them, as Quakers. And you are a professor of the comparative religions. Tell us, Jennifer, what is it in the Quaker philosophy that gave the background, gave the motivation, the inspiration for some of these women like Prudence Crandall to have the feelings about justice, equality, women's rights that they fought for during their lifetimes?
Sure. The Quakers have as one of their organizing principles the total spiritual equality of all people and the access that all people have to the Holy Spirit, the third person of the Christian Trinity. Quakers believed right from the start that all people, regardless of gender or education or income, everyone had access to the Spirit. Likewise, there were women among the earliest Quakers who were founders of the Quakers, the most significant being Margaret Fell, who was the wife of the founder of the Quakers, George Fox. And Margaret Fell wrote one of the first major declarations of women's equality in a book that defended women's right to speak. And so right from the beginning, Quakers were able to overlook human hierarchies. Now, that wasn't perfect. The Quakers had their own internal problems, but it was always a principle, and principles do make a difference. In the same way that you think about archery, which is you have a bullseye that you're aiming for. You don't hit it every time, but you're aiming for it. That's what ideals do. Ideals work like a kind of bullseye. You're aiming for it. When your group goes off a little bit, and there was a time when Quakers were owners of slaves in the colonial era in America, but if you're off from your bullseye, you could come back to it. And so the Quakers were able to do that. The other thing, and in Prudence Crandall's case, this was personal, is that because Quakers believed that men and women were spiritually equal, they allowed women to have an organizational role. So women were able to organize and speak in Quaker meetings. And there was an entire kind of institutionalized women's meeting where women took leadership positions. So women were used to speaking in public in the Quaker world. This meant that sliding over into a more political realm where you were willing to speak in public on issues like slavery or education, that was fairly easy for Quaker women who had some practice at public speaking, at least in their meetings and in the women's meetings. So there really was a strong legacy there, both in ideal terms and in practical terms. One of the things I've traced, though, is that a lot of the women abolitionists, especially in the 1830s and 40s, became impatient with how slow the Quakers were to move politically. And so Prudence Crandall, at the time that her school was open, was actually a Baptist. She had moved into this more enthusiastic religious enthusiasm, what we would call the Second Great Awakening. She had moved into that realm precisely because the Quakers were being a little too quiet and apolitical rather than taking on the beast of racism and slavery. And one of her classmates, who later became very famous in the abolitionist movement, Abby Kelly Foster. Abby Kelly also broke away from the Quakers, and there are a couple of other examples of this. So in a way, that Quaker training always stays with Prudence Crandall. It certainly stayed with her in a sartorial sense. She never really learned how to dress well. The Quakers simple dress, and she apparently even in some instances wore clothes made out of her own linens and draperies. So she never quite picked up the taste for high fashion. But she had left the Quakers behind as of 1831. So an interesting story in and of itself. But the Quakers certainly have a notable record of support for women's rights, unequaled by any other religious denomination on the Christian side.
Great. Well, that's an excellent explanation of that. Thank you.
Sure.
So let's get to your PowerPoint, and you can get started, Jennifer, as we tell the story of Prudence and then of the Harris sisters and the connection to, of course, Norwich, where they came from, and how they helped to integrate the school and what that led to. Let me go to the PowerPoint, the Crandall basic PowerPoint you've prepared.
Sure.
And here we go. Do you see that?
Yes.
Okay, great. Why don't you start, and we'll kind of alternate discussing. And Joanie, you'll come in the next slide, and we'll chat about the history as we go along.
This beautiful portrait of Prudence Crandall was commissioned by William Lloyd Garrison and other abolitionists in Boston in 1834. The original was given to Reverend Samuel May, who was one of Crandall's biggest supporters. He was the only Unitarian minister in Connecticut, lived right up the road from Canterbury in Brooklyn. He loaned Crandall some money, which, because of her husband, who the less said, the better, because of her husband, she was unable to pay back some of her debts. So he accepted the portrait as partial payment for the debt that Crandall owed him. And Reverend May ended up moving to the Syracuse area, where he became friends with Andrew White, the founder of Cornell University. And when Reverend May was dying, he offered to give all of his abolitionist papers to Cornell University. And he said, "I'll throw in the portrait of Prudence if you will admit women equally with men to your new university." And to this day, the beautiful original of that portrait hangs in the rare book room at Cornell. I have sat under it myself, and a beautiful copy of it is in the museum, and you will be able to see that when the museum reopens.
Okay, so when did Cornell admit women?
I believe it was in the 1870s.
Okay.
I don't know if it was from the exact moment of it starting, but it was, of all the Ivies, it was the one that has been coeducational for the longest time in its life.
And this portrait was painted in 1834, culminating in those couple of years when Prudence had the school, and there was so much tumultuous controversy about it, which we'll talk about. Okay, let's go.
Okay, go ahead. Yes. So I have been interpreting the story along the lens of the intersectionality, and I'll explain that theory in a moment, which is that we always have to take different oppressions in conjunction with each other. So that if you are Black and poor and not educationally privileged, that's different from being Black and wealthy and having an Ivy League degree, right? So looking at these different intersections. And so using the Canterbury theme, as everyone has from the beginning of the Canterbury Tales, I speak of them as the intersectional pilgrims in Canterbury. This is a portrait of the first Black student in the school. She's actually someone who would be described now as multiracial. We know she had African American, Native American, and European American heritage. And this was true of a number, at least 6 of Crandall's students were what would now be called multiracial people, most with Native American blood. Crandall herself was born in Rhode Island, but her family moved to Canterbury when she was a young girl. She attended Quaker schools and then, as I mentioned before, converted to the Baptists. She opened a female academy, which was only open to white students. Not that that was explicitly stated, but that was simply the norm at the time. The female academy movement was one that was sweeping New England. This was the highest form of education available to women at that moment in history. There were no colleges that admitted women. So this was the education at an academy was at the level of, say, an advanced private high school or even the first year of junior college. And in 1832, a Black student, Sarah Harris, asked to be admitted. We'll talk more about that story in a moment. Once Crandall decided to admit her, white parents became enraged and started threatening to, or actually removing, their daughters from the school. And so Crandall decided to reopen her academy for Black women only, which she did by April of 1833. This is the actual museum.
All right. Yes. Can we have Joanie talk about this now? Joanie, this is the actual museum. Tell us about this photo. And also tell us about, as Jennifer was talking, what was Canterbury like as a town back in 1831 when Prudence set up her school? What kind of town was it in Connecticut, in the United States? Okay.
Yeah, it was a burgeoning town. It was up and coming. The school itself, the house itself at the time is still directly across from the Canterbury Green. And during this time period, the closer your house was to the green, really the more wealthy you were. They were usually your most prominent houses. The green is also a location of the Congregationalist Church that was the most prominent church in Canterbury at that time period. The house was originally owned by Luther Payne, who was a merchant, and he passed away, and the site came up for sale. And the house was from 1805, and Prudence purchased it in 1831 when she was asked by the wealthy leading citizens of the town to create a school. Prudence was originally born in Rhode Island, but when she was 10 years old, her father moved to Canterbury and had a farm there. And her oldest brother, Hezekiah, was running a cotton mill by this time as well. So they were very involved in their community. She was well known by her community. She went to the Moses Brown School in Providence because, as Jennifer mentioned, education was very important. This was a Quaker school. So when she graduates from the school in Rhode Island, she comes back to Connecticut and she's teaching in district schools, what we would know as one-room schoolhouses today, in Lisbon and Plainfield. And so when she's asked to return to Canterbury, her hometown, and start this more, I guess, elevated school and academy, she's very interested in the idea. So she is able to purchase the property. She has $500 that the town loans her. And then she gets a mortgage from a neighbor because there's no banks during this time period to loan her money. So her neighbor loans her money. His name was Samuel Huff. And he gives her the second $1,500 with the stipulation in the deed, and this is important, that she has to pay him in full within 1 year's time. And that matters. She is able to do that by the tuition that she is charging, because had she not been able to pay off the school, had the mortgage been still on the property, Samuel Huff, who does not agree with her decision to turn it into a school for African-American students, this story would have been over very quickly, and they could have simply reclaimed the mortgage on the property and had Prudence leave the premises. So her ability to not only purchase the property outright, which is very unusual for women during this time period, as a single woman, and then also pay off the mortgage, so she is in ownership of the building and the property in Canterbury, is very important. And then also, as I mentioned, it is a prominent location in town. It is still on the corner of routes 14 and 169. I believe 169 may have been the Boston Post Road. So you're on a carriage line. So there's a lot of traffic essentially that's happening at this town. So by the time of Prudence's turning the school into a school for African-American students, and Canterbury is very upset. This is also occurring to them at a choice property and a prized piece of a town location, essentially. And so they're not happy with it for a plethora of reasons, but that is one of the reasons that they're upset with her. As a matter of fact, Jennifer will probably go into this, but her chief opponent, Andrew Judson, lived directly across the street from her, across what we call Route 14 now.
And but interestingly enough, when Crandall's allies offered to move her school to a less prominent location, they weren't having any of it. So they didn't want the school there anyway, anyhow.
It's true.
So as I said, the basic narrative is one that allows us to think that the white person, or in this case, Prudence Crandall, was a hero, and that she was acting in a way that was where she was thinking almost like a prophet ahead of her time. But when we think about it that way, we're erasing the fact that it was African Americans and women who were taking control here, who were using their agency to reshape their possibilities. And that's why, again, given what's happening in the news right now, this story is more vital than ever. One of the things we saw in the recent Black Lives Matter uprising was the joy with which African Americans saw so many white people out there also taking action and following the lead and genuinely listening to Black voices. And one of my contentions is that that kind of genuine listening was what was happening in Canterbury almost 200 years ago, and that very few Americans are aware of, that we actually have an anti-racist legacy if we start looking for it.
Right.
So intersectionality, as I mentioned before, is when we look at how these different, could you go back to the previous slide for just a moment, Sheila? I just wanted to make that point. Okay, no, we can only go forward. I guess that's one way of thinking of history. Which is, in this case, we have a few people who I call the great ancestors, the people like Moses Brown, who was the person who was running the school where Prudence Crandall got her education in Providence, Rhode Island. Moses Brown was part of the revolutionary generation, American revolutionary generation of anti-slavery advocates. He had converted from being a Baptist to being a Quaker. He went the other way, but he also was one of the first to liberate his slaves and to use his wealth to build for social justice instead. So a very interesting person who we know Prudence Crandall interacted with. And so there's also some African-American people who lead up to this moment. James Forten, a very wealthy Philadelphian Black businessman, had rejected the idea of what was called African colonization, which was the notion that people should be sent back to Africa, even if they'd never been there. Finally, we get to that moment when a Black man, William Watkins, was able to influence a prominent white man, William Lloyd Garrison, who became the editor of the newspaper called The Liberator. Watkins was able to say to Garrison, colonization is wrong. And if you go to the next slide, what Garrison said here in 1829, he said, I highlight this because I think it may be the first time that a white man listened to a black man, and the white man then said, you're right, I'm wrong, I apologize, and I'll correct my errors, right? And so Garrison renounced colonization, and he started to publish in his newspaper, The Liberator, he started to publish black writers, both living and dead. And William Watkins himself was the adoptive father to a very important feminist, one of the black feminists involved in the suffrage movement in the latter part of the 19th century, Frances Ellen Watkins Harper, who's also one of the first black novelists.
Now, Jennifer, how much did Prudence Crandall know about the Liberator? Did she ever read the paper? How was she?
She read the paper, and that's the magic of this. But she read the paper because a black woman brought it to her. Go ahead. Let me see on the next slide. I think I've got the, so move on to the next one because I can encapsulate this one. And go on to the next one. This is beautiful stuff, but, and I have to get a cat in because you can't be in the 21st century without a cat video. But go ahead, go ahead to the next slide. So what happens is that one of the people first published in The Liberator is a black woman in Boston, Maria Stewart. And she is the first American-born woman of any race to speak on political issues before a mixed audience of men and women. Why she isn't known by everybody, I don't know, but I'll keep telling folks. And so her writings were being published in The Liberator. In the meantime, a Liberator reader by the name of Maria Davis had moved to the Canterbury area because she was engaged to Charles Harris, who was the brother of Sarah Harris. Maria Davis became a live-in household helper at Crandall's school. Maria Davis sensed that her employer, Prudence Crandall, was someone who had a heart that might be open to racial justice. And so she started leaving issues of The Liberator around. Why did she have extra issues to leave around? Because her future father-in-law, William Harris, was an agent for The Liberator in southeastern Connecticut. So Maria Davis left those issues. Prudence Crandall read them, and she said, in the pages of this newspaper, I saw the dilemma in which our African Americans existed, and I saw the injustices. And once Crandall had started reading The Liberator, comes the next step in this, which is that Sarah Harris is also reading The Liberator, and she decides to ask Crandall if she could attend the school so that she could become a school teacher herself one day. So we can see here that it was African-American women, African-American thinkers and writers, and the white man, William Lloyd Garrison, who was willing to actually listen to blacks. They start the change. And it's almost like you can see this complicated machinery of the very few people, a cognitive minority, who are able to institute the change. It all hinged on what Crandall would say.
Interesting. So I have a couple of questions.
Sure.
First of all, Joanie, were there any black citizens living in Canterbury? We know there were in Norwich, and we're going to get to that in another moment. Were there any black residents in the town of Canterbury? And for both of you, we now refer to our black brothers and sisters as African Americans, especially those who were descended from the slave populations. What did they call African Americans back in the 1800s? What term did they use?
Well, Sheila, the polite terms for African Americans during the 1800s were either colored or Negro.
Right.
I still use, when I invite people to the museum, and I make it very clear that I use the term African American because it is the proper term that we use today. And I want to make sure that everyone feels welcome when they enter the building. But they will see copies of The Liberator where either the term Negro or colored is used. We do not put anything on display that is anything more offensive. And I don't think we have anything in our collection that would demonstrate the anger that was portrayed at those students either. Your question about the African American community in Canterbury at the time, there certainly was a community there, and it was the community that William Harris and Sally Prentice Harris, who were Sarah Harris's parents, moved into. They were also farmers in Canterbury as well, and Sarah Harris was raised primarily in Norwich. She did go to school in Norwich as well. So there's a little bit of a misnomer. People think that Sarah Harris went to Canterbury district schools, but she did not. Some of her siblings did, but she was older at the time that they had moved to Canterbury. And what's interesting too is that not only is William Harris's name on the deeds of property, but Sally Prentice Harris, her name is also on the deeds of the properties that they purchased as well, which is very interesting. And some of their properties did abut the properties of people that were very against Sarah getting the education that she was trying to obtain at Prudence's school. There's been some conjecture that maybe it were property disputes. That could be why Canterbury was not happy with this, because the Harris family was purchasing larger amounts of property than the white residents felt was proper for them to own, but they were successful farmers and doing well. As you can see, they were able to pay for Sarah to attend Prudence's Academy at that time, which for the full package was $36 a semester, which was, I believe, 12 weeks. And that was fairly expensive at the time. Sarah was not a boarding student. She was a day student, which meant that she came in the day and returned like our students do today. But Prudence, of course, did run a boarding school as well, where people could spend the night. It's my understanding, and Dr. Rycenga, please correct me if I'm wrong, but Sarah was working as a servant in another household when she approached Prudence to become a teacher as well.
Yes, that's correct. And a large part of the Black community in Canterbury were people who were working as servants, because there was a fairly substantial, for a village, substantial upscale population in Canterbury that would have had a need for household servants and farm labor. And so the community was in many ways, the Black community in Canterbury was in many ways isolated into different households and not as unified as the community at Norwich, which had its own institutions and kind of a political know-how in Norwich that was lacking in the Canterbury community.
Okay, so it says that Sarah was persistent with Crandall. She wanted to become a teacher, and so she wanted to go to the school. And that sparked the next year or more of this tumultuous history. Let's get into that.
Yeah, go ahead to the next slide, because this is more of a summary one. This is the actual gravesite of Mariah Davis Harris. You'll see she's also there known as Anne Mariah. And she apparently always went by her middle name. And interestingly, this grave had not even been looked for until I uncovered it with the previous curator, Kaz Kozlowski. About 5 years ago, we found it kind of in plain view, right in Norwich, the main Norwich Cemetery. Go ahead. And this is what Harris asked Sarah Harris. She said, "I want to get a little more learning, if possible, enough to teach colored children. And if you admit me to your school, I shall forever be under the greatest obligation to you." And indeed, Sarah Harris and Prudence Crandall remained friends for their entire lives. And Sarah Harris paid a month-long visit to Crandall when they were both older women after the Civil War, when Crandall was living in Kansas. So they did, in fact, remain friends. And when you think of how rare genuine white-Black friendships are even now, to think of one being that prominent in both women's lives in the 19th century is inspiring. Go ahead.
And Sarah Harris also named her first daughter Prudence Crandall Fairweather.
Yes. And so what Crandall's report on Harris's request was that her repeated solicitation. So when I talk about persistence, Sarah Harris knew that Crandall wanted to say yes. And Crandall and Sarah Harris both realized that there could be risks in admitting a Black student. And so Crandall said, I told her if I was injured on her account, I could bear it. She might enter as one of my pupils. And one of the things that Prudence Crandall did as a devout Baptist at that time was she used the Bible as a kind of talisman. She randomly opened it to a page. And I love to say this, she the Spirit was leading her in a strange way because she opened to Ecclesiastes, which is the single most pessimistic and kind of nihilistic book in the Bible. It's the one that's given us there's a time for everything and there's nothing new under the sun and so on. But she opened it to the passage that said the oppressed had no one to stand with them. Mm-hmm. And so she said, oh, okay, well, apparently God's telling me I'm supposed to stand with the oppressed.
Right. Jennifer, are there any other examples during that period of time in our history when there was any kind of integration of Blacks and whites in a school setting, or is this a first?
For the brief time that her school was had both Black and white students, it was certainly unusual. It wasn't the first. We know that there was a Black student who went to Bowdoin College, John Russworm. And there were probably at the district schools, they were somewhat integrated. And so there's a few other examples, but to be doing it consciously for the reason of thinking about education as equal and available to all people, especially higher education, this was a first.
Okay.
Right. And I say that with some caution because, we historians, you can always find an earlier example if you search hard enough. But right. As a conscious attempt to put an anti-racist notion, a notion of equal access to education, yes, that was very unusual. Now, she changes it to a school for only Black women. And in doing that, she makes an even bolder statement that African Americans are deserving of higher education.
Well, she did that as a matter of principle and philosophy, but she also did it as a matter of necessity because the whites fled from her school when she admitted Sarah. Isn't that so?
Precisely. And it's the very moment that her school closes in September of 1834, a new school opened in New Hampshire, in Canaan, in 1834, that was fully integrated, white and Black, male and female. And that school was literally ripped off its foundations not even a year later.
Yeah.
By angry white people. But there you did have some white students who were willing to also enter into that experiment.
And then you talk about the importance of William Lloyd Garrison and the
Liberator. So we can move on because we've talked about him. Right. But once she meets with Garrison, Crandall goes to Garrison, and they were strangers to each other before then. But Garrison gets behind her project of having a school for Black women and sends her to Providence, where she meets up with two white allies, George and Henry Benson, who are young men who are anti-slavery and very independent in their religious thought. And she also meets up with a Black woman, Elizabeth Hammond, who is a widow, who is running a boarding house. And a boarding house at that time was kind of like running a hotel. But a single woman who's running a hotel has to always be worried about issues of reputation and good moral standing, so that her hotel does not disintegrate into being a different kind of house. And she takes Crandall under her wing, shows her around, and ends up sending two of her own daughters to Crandall School. So once again, we see this white and Black working together moment in Providence, because it was George and Henry Benson who knew Elizabeth Hammond and introduced them to each other. So the Benson family ends up becoming very important. The father of George and Henry was an associate of Moses Brown, who had worked with him on abolition. Also, his daughters became some of Crandall's best friends and strongest allies. And one of his daughters, Helen Benson, ends up becoming Mrs. William Lloyd Garrison. So the families become intertwined. But very importantly, there's one important Black woman, Sojourner Truth, and an important white woman, Olive Gilbert, who meet up through the Bensons, and both of them connect to Crandall's story. Olive Gilbert was inspired by Crandall's story. She was a white woman who became the editor and sort of ghostwriter for Sojourner Truth's first autobiography.
Great. And New York always plays a role.
Yeah, no, then Crandall gets down to New York City. Think about this. 30-year-old unmarried white woman goes to visit Black men in New York City in 1831. Or 33 rather. It's kind of shocking. But here she connects with a whole network of Black ministers, Baptist, Presbyterian, Congregational, and Episcopalian, all of whom become endorsers for her school. Their names are listed there. Go ahead. And this turns into Crandall connecting to an entire network of African-American male leaders in the free Black North who are organizing conventions, who are fighting for their rights, who are debating whether to stay in the United States or go somewhere else, who are trying to figure out how to involve women in this movement for change. Go ahead. Then she goes on to New Haven, where she meets up with Simeon Jocelyn, who's going to become a great ally of hers, another white man, and also Arthur Tappan, who's a very wealthy white man, who is the leading white evangelical leader in the abolitionist movement. And he stakes Crandall School. He says, I will support you with whatever financial resources you need. Jocelyn had tried to establish a Black college for African-American men in New Haven in 1831. That was put to a vote, and they lost 700-6. I know the names of 5 people who voted against it, but I consider it the most overwhelming electoral defeat in American history. But Simeon Jocelyn was the white minister of a Black church. So he was another person who had direct experience of actually talking and listening to African Americans in the North. His gravesite is, in fact, it has been vandalized, and I'm hoping that one of the things I can do is make sure he's honored properly. That's not correct. Go ahead.
Yeah.
And then a few of the other white endorsers, and go ahead to the next slide, because this is the best document we have from the entire abolitionist movement, as far as I'm concerned. It is the most.
Yeah, Joanie, do you have that in the museum? Can we see that?
I have copies of it in the museum, not the original. It was printed in the Liberator magazine.
Okay.
Yeah, and actually the museum does sell postcards of it. So I recommend you send this to all your friends. And in it, she indicates that the school is going to be open, and you can read the text there, the reception of young ladies and little misses of color. And that might sound patronizing to us, but it is not. These were terms of respect. A young lady and a little miss. Those were not how Black women were usually addressed, right? And we can see even now with Aunt Jemima kind of kicking the bucket this last month. It was usually, if friendly, terms like that, like boy or aunt or whatever, and not young lady and little miss. And so she indicated right away equality, but then the men who signed on as the endorsers of her school were 15 in number, 8 Black and 7 white. There is no other document from the abolitionist era that I have found that is this racially balanced. The Black ministers are not distinguished from the white ministers. When I first saw this, I did not even know 3 of the names on it. I had to research them to find out who they were. They're organized by location, not by race.
Well, this is terrific.
Yes, I know. You started.
I know. What I want to do right now is chat a bit, and then we're going to call this part 1. Okay. We have to do it again. We have to go through the tumultuous year, all the legal wrangling, all the opposition. It only gets
better and worse.
And then set upon our discussion of the lessons for today's world. So before we end today, and we're going to continue it and get another date, which we will be announcing, because This topic is too important for just one show. We've got to keep it going. It's terrific. Tell us, each of you, why we need to keep it going, why it's so important, especially what's happening in today's world. Jennifer, you start, and then Joanie.
Well, right now we're at this place where socially, where we actually do have a moment when people are open to really listening and learning. And I've been feeling over the last 2 months that we scholars and museum professionals, we've been preparing for this moment, and we have treasures to share. We have an anti-racist legacy, as I said earlier, that Americans can learn about and understand that while our country has many sins that need to be expiated, we have people who've been working on that project. We're not alone. And that there's a different cast of heroes, a different cast of people who deserve to be cast in stone as the new statues to replace the ones that are coming down. And so I want us to share these stories, but I do also want to stress that we've got to keep women in the story. We have to keep women's intellect, women's intelligence, women's force, women's political activity. All of this has to remain, or it's too easy for things to slide back into an all-male story. And the Crandall story is unique in having males who are respecting what women are doing, and in having whites who are respecting what blacks are doing. And I think that we need stories like that. So that's why I think it's important right now.
Great. Joanie, your thoughts?
Yes, absolutely. Very recently in the New York Times, Secretary of the Smithsonian, Lonnie Bunch III, advocated for something that is going on in the museum community for a while now, called social justice in museums, where we are the place of relevance, because as Jennifer said, we are the places where this history actually happened. And we need to be that safe place where we can continue to have the dialogues of difficult history, to not only serve as inspiration, but also as a road map to help us go on to our next better America that we can be, by learning from the past. Because, you know, the Prudence Crandall story, and why I'm so excited to be in the role I am in today, is because I'm still utilizing that mission that Prudence created with Sarah and Mariah Davis. You know, Black education matters. This is important as we're looking toward schools that are still dealing with issues of segregation and not proper funding. And we can be that place where these conversations can take place by building on the foundation that Prudence and Sarah made in the past, and becoming relevant, not simply telling a story about what happened back then, but how these court cases were used with Dred Scott and with Brown versus Board of Education, potentially trials into the 21st century as well, and how it highlights that history and can help be that place of moving us forward too.
Well, it's so important. You mentioned Brown versus Board. You know, as an attorney in law school and constitutional law, the Brown versus Board case was very important in desegregation of our country. And Prudence Crandall is mentioned in some of the briefs for that case. So there we go. We go round and round. And so she got to be more well known. We are going to continue the story. Please stay tuned. What happens when she tries to integrate the school and bring Sarah Harris into the school as a student? We're going to find out. It's fascinating. And Jennifer and Joanie are going to help us do that. So until we have our next meeting, this is an important time. Everyone, please learn about women's history. Remember, this is the centennial of the 100th anniversary of the 19th Amendment, the right to vote. How much more important could it be in this year of 2020 with November on the horizon? We'll see you next time on Talk Back. Again, thank you, Jennifer. Thank you, Joanie. We're going to see you next time. Stay tuned. Bye.